All right, take a second and prepare a new quad chart for this lesson on unresolved conflict. We're going to be looking at the end of the Korean War, and our essential question is, what were the long-term consequences of President Truman's firing of General MacArthur? We finished up the last lesson with Truman calling MacArthur back to Washington, D.C., and replacing him with Matt Ridgway as the commander of all forces, UN forces in Korea. And this is really an element of poor decisions on Truman's part, and his decision to remove MacArthur, the guy with really the most experience in the Pacific of any of his commanders. I mean, MacArthur spent over 10 years there through World War II, before World War II, and then after. And he puts Ridgway, and he was a very competent general, but he claims he's confident that he can push the Chinese forces back to the Yalu River and declare a total victory. So again, we see this military commander who is understands warfare, understands how to win. But what is total victory in a limited warfare campaign that the president has had? And it's just indicative of this dispute or this difference in policy between the military and the president. Ridgway understands that the status of the Korean and the Chinese forces is at a point where he could actually defeat them. Their morale is low. They lack reinforcements themselves. They're so far down away from the Chinese border that Ridgway is advocating for just pushing. But Truman halts and decides to take them to the peace table. This map shows the front lines on 10 July 1951. Here you can see this line generally following terrain, but declared at the 38th parallel for the most part. Seoul, the capital of the South Korean country, is right down here, as well as the 8th Army. All of the blue forces here are a combination of United Nations forces. They're divisions, and you have South Korean forces, some other UN augmentees, and the United States forces in there as part of the 8th Army. On the other side of the border, you see both corps and army size elements in red. So the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army from China, and then NK are the corps units that are on the other side of the border. And, they're there kind of as a stalemate. Everybody's stopped fighting. Truman has called them to the peace table. I shouldn't say they stopped fighting. They're still having skirmishes across the border, but they're not actively trying to take terrain. And this is where really the Korean War begins to end along this stalemated line that we still kind of acknowledge today. Truman, again, is focusing on Europe, not concerned as much with what's going on in Asia. His Europe first policy and rebuilding Europe after World War II is what he wants to do. But he does want to end the war. And so does China. China's experienced too many losses in this. So that line that kind of showed in that map is where we settled into a defense, really starting to resemble World War I. Frontline trenches are dug in. We don't add any more forces into the fight in North Korea. What Ridgway has is kind of what he's going to have until it's over. We are using air forces and artillery to keep the Chinese kind of huddled down so that they're not attacking anything. And it really just becomes a display of the amount of firepower that Western armies can present versus just the numbers that the Chinese present. Before we go on to this, look at this photo. And this is something that really I remember from my tour in Korea. I spent a year in Korea in 1989. But everywhere I went in Korea, the vegetation was still reduced. So in a war that was really fought by aircraft and lots of artillery, there are very few areas that still have trees and vegetation, and where they are, it's fairly sparse. It's a rugged country, very, very hilly and steep in a lot of places. And some of the major battles are taking place when the United States was occupying low ground and the Chinese were on the high ground, and they would have to fight up. So this picture kind of shows and gives an example of what that might have looked like. Both the United Nations and the Chinese and North Korean communists apply a similar strategy. They're fixing their defensive line. So fix is a tactical term that means to prevent the enemy from moving. So what we wanted to do is just keep them in place. They wanted to keep us in place. We're not taking any more land from them, and they're not taking any more land from us. And it kind of sets the stage for some type of negotiations to take place. There are exchanges of aircraft bombs and artillery. There are some limited raids going across enemy lines. Oftentimes, this results in capturing prisoners of war, and this happens on both sides of the line when the North would come across and we would go across to the north. A lot of this happens in an area called the Punch Bowl. Here's another photo. Just look at the vegetation. These guys are going up to clear a hill. We see flamethrowers. A lot of the stuff used that completely leaves that area of the world void of vegetation still today. Some significant battles that happened at the Battle of Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, and Pork Chop Hill. So here's a map of the Punch Bowl area, and you can see that the elevation down here is shown from 0 up to 1,000 meters and above. So we're talking from the bottom going up some of these hills is 2,000 to 3,000 feet that they're fighting, and a significant disadvantage when you're fighting going uphill. I mean, think grenades roll downhill. It's easier to fire down. Firing uphill requires an adjustment in aiming, and a lot of the base level soldiers aren't trained on how to engage like that. This area in the Korean War resulted in 3 Congressional Medals of Honor. So some fierce fighting that happened along some of these ridge lines. There's Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and then the Punch Bowl area. Obviously, this large depression in the mountains, and if you're in the bottom, the artillery shells, grenades, machine gun fire, everything raining down on you. Who controls this highland? Right, these high ridges are really who is controlling the battle at that period of time. And that's why we constantly went back and forth to take these hills. We would lose the hills, we would take them, and lost just a lot of human capital in some of these areas. This is a complete result in stalemated politics. So, the question I always ask if we're in class is, how can stalemated politics affect the outcome of combat? The political leaders want the war to end. They want us to stop. Military leaders don't understand that. They only understand how to react to conditions on the ground. So if you're in one of those lowlands, or you get beaten off of a hill, right, you're not really trying to take any ground in North Korea, but you have to maintain those highlands. And Korea becomes a battle. It becomes a war of taking these small hilltops, losing lives and mass casualties with really no strategic gain. New leadership is kind of the key to how we get out of the Korean War. Truman becomes very unpopular. He's got a national approval rating of about 22%. And former General Eisenhower, hero of World War II, winner of Operation Overlord, starts campaigning against him and highlighting corruption in the Truman administration, the stalemate in Korea and how he could fix that. That Harry Truman had been soft on communism and allowed the Chinese to come in to do this. And he wins in a landslide election, getting 442 electoral votes. There's now President Eisenhower. And immediately what he does is he threatens China. He said, listen, you are going to come to the peace table and we're going to negotiate this, or I will drop nuclear bombs on you. And that brings the Chinese to the table with a promise to end the war. But it doesn't happen immediately. They go on to about 2 more years of peace talks, and there are major disagreements, primarily over what's going to happen to the prisoners of war. And what happens to the prisoner of war is that there are 22,000 Chinese and North Korean prisoners in the South that refuse to return. So in refusing to return north, there's this disagreement that if they don't get theirs back, well, they're not gonna release ours to us. So, and that really held us up a lot. But you could imagine, after experience, even being held as a prisoner of war in the South was a better life than what they'd experienced under communism in North Korea or in China. So that was a huge slowing process for what was going on. Ultimately, we do declare the demilitarized zone, which is still in place in North Korea today. Here you see the approximate number of casualties from the United Nations, 130,000, about 500,000 specific to the Republic of Korea. A lot of that happened on the initial push in by the North Koreans. And here's the DMZ today, still roughly in the same location as I showed you on the map on the first slide. One of the things that's really become part of the Korean War or the aftermath of the Korean War, because it's not over, right? We're just on a ceasefire, has been the North Koreans' attempts to tunnel underneath the demilitarized zone and then conduct espionage or sabotage activities inside of the South Korea. They haven't gotten through. As far as we know, all of these tunnels have been found and either destroyed or blocked up. The DMZ, interestingly, is something that both sides for years have patrolled a section of. So within the demilitarized zone, we knew this type of activity was going on. So when I was there in 1989, we conducted live raid and ambush patrols inside of the DMZ. And there have been instances since the end of the Korean War all the way up until most recently a few years ago with a defector trying to come across, where there have been skirmishes and firefights between U.S. forces and North Korean forces. Rarely is any of that ever reported in the news. This is the truce village at the Joint Security Area in Panmunjom. And this is where all of the peace talks or any negotiations between North Korea and another country takes place. If you look on one side, these are North Korean soldiers. On the other side are U.S. MPs. This line right here is never crossed. This is communist territory. On the other side is free. Inside of the building, the line continues, and members of the communist state sit on one side, and members of the people meeting them sit on the other side. And that line is never crossed. And again, there is still no peace treaty today. The North claimed victory. They still claim victory. This is communist propaganda. And the Republic of Korea in the South still remains free and democratic. And no picture can highlight that more than looking at satellite footage of the countries at night. Here you see that bright splash of light is Seoul, South Korea, the capital. And here you see Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. And nowhere else in Korea is there power, is there light, or is there any prosperity? Differences today, the North has evolved, has modern weapons, it has nuclear technology, doesn't have a missile system, like I've said in class, to deliver to us. They have plenty of war plans, 180,000 special forces soldiers, 1.5 million standing army. They have everybody in their army, like a lot of communist countries, that they could call up in almost like a reserve status. That we talked a little bit about the underground and tunnel warfare, trying to get through to the south. Well-developed fortifications. One of the things I remember from my tour and being up north toward the DMZ is both sides are very well fortified. All of their artillery positions are inside the sides of mountains. So they have great big steel doors that would open up. The artillery guns will come out, they'll fire, they'll go back inside, the doors will close, and they're protected from counter battery fire. That would be similar on both sides of the border. The North Korea is known for its air defense systems. When I was years ago in the Army, I had to plan an operation in training to take on an invasion of North Korea. And one of the hardest things to ever get around would be their air defense systems. Unlike some of the conflicts you've seen us fight in the past with Afghanistan and Iraq, nobody has that type of technology. And it would take a significant effort just to destroy that at first before you could ever take any type of troops in. And then finally, cyber warfare, something that's really come into public knowledge. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, there are attempts, both the Chinese and the North Koreans' attempts to disrupt other nations' economies and abilities to have influence in the world through cyber attacks. Just a comparison of the North Korean and the South Korean military. North Korean has a significant military advantage in most things, except they don't have the backing of the rest of the world like the South does.